Hello, I'm Corey Bretschneider. I'd like to welcome you to the Janus Forum. I'd like to say just before I introduce Anthony Stalin, who's going to moderate the debate. This is a student-run forum, so in the spirit, we have student moderators. But I just wanted to just welcome you by noting a couple of really unique and interesting things about the Janus Forum. The first is in the spirit of the new curriculum at Brown. Largely, the new curriculum was started by student initiative. This too was started by student initiative. A group of students decided that they were not exactly happy with the existing programming of speakers at Brown, and that rather than have just one voice, they were going to invite people to have multiple voices and have multiple participants on issues of the day. The other thing that they did, and to their great success, I think, is have student leaders get together in fairly large groups to deliberate about what these speakers should be talking about and who to invite. So I think it's just a great success that the method of the forum coincides with its message, right? That the way of choosing speakers meets with the idea of multiple voices. And I'll note just a second thing over the years that I've noticed about this forum, and I think today will be no exception. Not only as today are the speakers of extremely high quality and prominence, quality of mind, and well regarded in their fields, but also they come at issues from not the way that you might expect when you walk in. And so today I invite you to think about that too, right? It's not that there are ready-made answers to questions about democracy or questions about race, many of which we'll explore today. And the speakers have done a wonderful job, I think, of kind of getting out of that idea of two opinions, right? You'll see there are multiple approaches to this issue. So in that spirit of multiple voices and a student-run forum, I welcome you here today. And I'd like to turn over the mic in the forum to Anthony Stalin. Please join me in welcoming Jim Sleeper and Lani Guinier and our moderator, Anthony Stalin.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Stalin, the Executive Director of the Janus Forum, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 15th Janus Lecture entitled, Does Race Matter? Minority Groups and Political Representation. As we're joined today by two experts on the topic, and I think we're really set to have a great conversation, I'll keep my introduction very short. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Janus Forum, and especially about how these lectures are planned. So the Janus Forum is a student group that seeks to encourage and elevate the level of thought, debate, and discussion around political and social ideas at Brown. And we do this through a broad range of events. We host Janus Conversations, which are small lectures with Brown professors. We also hold lunch seminars at the faculty club, where Brown students can come and enjoy a free meal while discussing a predefined topic. We also host student debates, and then of course, there are the Janus lectures. And most of you probably already knew all of that, but what you may not know is that the structure of the organization that's in charge of planning the lectures like the one today is radically different and unique at Brown. Contrary to most other groups, the Janus Forum Executive Board, including myself, is not involved in the choice of topics or speakers for these lectures. Rather, an independent board called the Janus Forum Steering Committee makes all the decisions pertaining to the lectures. And what's special and unique about this steering committee is that it is comprised of representatives from each of the most politically active groups on Brown's campus, as well as 3 at-large representatives. And the steering committee members come from more than 15 different student organizations, and this number continues to grow every year as we receive new group applications. Groups like the Brown Democrats and Republicans, the Queer Alliance, Amnesty International, Hillel, and SSDP each send one representative to the steering committee, where these members spend the entire year planning the following year's Janus lectures. And these different and opposing groups come together to contribute their distinctive perspective and ultimately to decide how to spark the most stimulating, critical, and open-minded exchange of ideas at Brown. As a result, these Janus lectures, as well as the other Janus Forum events, accomplish our mission of providing a place where Brown students can challenge their own beliefs and explore a broad range of ideas and then arrive at their own convictions, knowing not only what they believe, but why they believe it. I'm happy to announce today that if any part of this mission is appealing to you, we're currently accepting applications for the 2010 Executive Board. And these applications can be found on our website at janusforum.org. This presents a nice segue into me announcing that this morning we launched our new website, which you may have seen in the PowerPoint presentation. And starting today, you can visit the site and you'll have an opportunity to review pictures and videos of lectures and other events, as well as checking out a calendar of all the upcoming events and what kind of opportunities there are to get involved in the Janus Forum. But getting back to the topic at hand, we're gathered today to discuss fundamental issues concerning the role of identity in politics. How are minority groups best represented? Can a member of a group better represent that group's interests than a non-member? Does shared identity lead to better representation? To answer these questions, we're joined by two distinguished guests who will each speak for about 25 minutes. Professor Lani Guinier will go first. She is a legal scholar, former civil rights lawyer, and currently a professor at Harvard Law School. Professor Guinier will be followed by Mr. Jim Sleeper. Mr. Sleeper is a writer on American civic culture and politics and a lecturer in political science at Yale. After both speakers are finished, they will have the opportunity to ask each other one question, and following that, we'll open up the debate to the audience members who will have the chance to ask their own questions. Finally, after the question and answer session, we invite you all to join us in the front hall for a small catered reception. And now you've heard more than enough from me, so please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Lani Guinier.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. The conveners of this forum and I have been having a debate as to what the topic actually is. So I may not keep on message, and if that's the case, then I invite you to bring me back to the message during the question and answer period. I'd like to start by telling you about an experience that I had when my son was about 9 or 10 years old, and we were getting ready to move from the University of Pennsylvania Law School I think this is a little too high. From the University of Pennsylvania Law School to Harvard, where I now teach, and his friends were having a going-away party for him. They decided they were going to play some games, and the first game that they played was a golf ball relay race, in which the object of the game was to carry a golf ball on a spoon and take it from one end of the backyard to another, and not cup the spoon in your hand, but hold it by the stem of the spoon, and then pass this spoon with the golf ball still intact to your team member. And once all of the various members finished, whichever group got there first would win. And they decided they were going to divide up these groups, the girls versus the boys. They ran the race, and the girls won. The boys, of course, demanded a recount or a rematch. So in the second iteration, although it was also true in the first, a group of us who were watching noticed that the boys had a very different view of how you win a golf ball relay race than the girls. So the boys took the golf ball in the cup of the spoon and then just hauled it to the other end of the yard, which was violating the rules. The girls did not cheat. They were very deliberative about holding that golf ball onto the spoon. Second time they ran the race, girls still won. Now, there's a group of us, as I said, many of us are academics, and we are watching this game. And of course, since we're academics, the first thing academics do when they are watching something is they have to deconstruct what they are seeing. So the impulse was to see this very much as an issue of identity, an issue of the girls versus the boys, that there were several things that seemed to become obvious. Girls don't cheat. Boys think that speed alone is going to get them first to the finish line. Girls are much more careful about following the rules. And we're having this conversation about gender identity, and my mom, who was a former high school English teacher, was also present, and she interrupted to ask a very important question. She said, "Who designed the game?" It turned out it was the girls. The girls were the hosts of the party, and they had designed the game, and one of the conclusions that we ultimately drew was that the girls had designed a game that they thought they could actually play and win. Now, of course, my son was very upset about this entire episode, especially because after the game was over, the girls were so triumphant in their success that they decided they would play another game, and the rule in this new game is that no boys were allowed. So my son, he thinks he's the person in whose honor this party is being given, and he can't even play. He comes up to me to complain. I said, well, go play with the boys. He said, no, he can't, because the girls are in a majority. And knowing all of the work I had done on majority rule, he decided that if you're not in the majority, you obviously don't have any power. Now, I tell you this story because my mom's question, I think, is really essential to understanding the way in which we practice political representation in this country. And before we can talk about the role of identity in politics, we have to understand who designed the game and what was their objective in that design. And the game was obviously designed by men. Was designed by white men. It was designed by many white men who owned slaves. It was designed by many white men who didn't own slaves but who felt they had to compromise with those who did. And it included provisions in terms of the Constitution of the United States that determined that slaves were 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation, which was not simply an effort to stigmatize slaves or black people as saying they were less than human. It was an effort to award additional representation to the slave owners, because the 3/5 of a person meant that slaves could be counted in the apportionment of districts and in the apportionment, therefore, of power in the United States Congress. Now, having said all of this, and thinking about who designed the game, and thinking about James Madison, one of the premier architects of the Constitution, who also owned slaves, it's really important to understand the role that the British legacy played in the rules of this game, because one of the assumptions in this design was that those who were elected, those who were presumed to be in a position to represent others, were the natural aristocracy of the community. And the natural aristocracy of the community meant that these were people who preferably would become representatives by acclamation rather than by election. They had formal elections for the purpose of legitimacy, but there was a sense in which having an actual election where the natural leader of the community would have to face an opponent was an insult to that person's claim on the position of power, because there was a sense that those who were the natural leaders would be obvious and everyone else should just bow out of competition. That's where we started. Now we come to the year 2009, almost 2010, and we now have someone who is married to a granddaughter, a great-granddaughter of former slaves, as President of the United States. And the question is raised, well, does race matter, and what's the role of identity in politics? And I want to make the claim that the role of identity or the role of race in politics is very, very important as a means for us to get to the question that my mom asked in the context of the golf ball relay race game, and that is, when we see what's happening with minority groups, and it could be women, it could be gays and lesbians, but in terms of the grand narrative of this country, it is race, and it is the failure to deal with the legacy of slavery in particular that draws out many of the ambiguities and the dissonances in our constitutional arrangement. but it is by focusing on the way in which blacks and other people of color are represented that we can begin to see the flaws in the game itself. So that the issue is really not, are blacks being appropriately represented in our system of winner-take-all elections in which geographic districts are the foundational unit for allocating power. The question is really, if you examine the experience of people of color and examine that experience from the perspective of the canary in the coal mines, you will see that the experience of those who have been left out, the experience of those who've been marginalized, is often a diagnostic tool that can help us all to see what's wrong with the atmosphere in the mines more generally. So I'm making this analogy to the canary in the mines because the miners used to take a canary into the coal mines to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was too toxic for the miners. And the canary was more fragile. It had a respiratory system that was weaker, more vulnerable. And so when the canary started to gasp for breath, that was a sign that the miners needed to leave the mine, not that the canary was somehow inadequate. The way in which we tend to think about issues of race or issues of gender is to see the canary gasping for breath as a sign that there is a problem with the canary, and therefore we have to begin to fix the canary. And I am suggesting an alternative frame, which is when the canary is gasping for breath, it is time for us to think about fixing the atmosphere in the mines, not just so the canary can breathe and live, but so that the miners can also survive. So that's the frame in which I am approaching this particular question. And I want to suggest that the key problem in our system of representation is our misunderstanding of the role of representation. So we tend to think about representatives as one of 3 or 4 categories, depending on who you ask. So one is we elect representatives, and that makes us a democracy because people have this sanctified moment of choice when they can go to the polls and choose who's going to represent them. And yet remember, going back to this notion that contested elections are really not a good idea because the goal is to identify the natural leaders of the community. Well, there's an assumption that we are actually looking for someone who can rise above politics. We are looking for an individual who captures in his or her character the qualities of virtue, the qualities of impartiality, who are going to be able to exercise the conscience of the community on behalf of the community. So that's one model of representation, which is the trustee model. We elect someone who is civically virtuous, who will function as our trustee on our behalf based on consulting their own conscience. The second model is the delegate model. That is, we have an aroused populace. They have a good sense of what it is that they want, and they're going to choose someone who is in a position to carry forward their mandate, right? That they have an idea of what they want, and they're going to give that idea to the person who's elected, and that person is then going to follow through. And then you have this idea, which may have been in the minds of those who were constructing the question for this forum, that we're looking for someone who looks just like us. We're looking for someone who has the same experiences that we have because we can trust that person more, and we can give that person a mandate, and they will, because they're one of us, follow it, right? And this is the descriptive notion of representation, or what some people might call identity politics. I said there were 3 or 4 models depending on how you count or who you speak to, and the fourth one is this savior model of politics, and I add that just to round out the categories, and this is in some ways what people think they did when they voted for Barack Obama. That is, they elected someone who was just going to make all the decisions on behalf of us. He's a very bright guy. He also shares the youthfulness of a country that's looking forward. For Black Americans, he is one of them, so they're going to vote for him. And he's going to save this country from all that went wrong with it in the past or the previous 8 years. And so in that sense, he's a combination of the descriptive, the delegate, and the trustee model all rolled into one. And I want to suggest that there is a flaw with all of those models, right? Looking at this from the perspective of the canary in the coal mines, that is from the perspective of people who are in a minority, because our commitment to representation in this country is a commitment to winner-take-all representation. And winner-take-all representation means that you represent a geographic district. The contours of that district are drawn by the incumbent politicians. The incumbent politicians have a very strong interest in being reelected. They choose voters whom they want to represent rather than the voters choosing whom they want to represent them. And then, if they get 51% of the votes or more, they are declared the winner who can speak on behalf of all of the people who live in that district, including the people who voted against them. So there is an anomaly here that somehow the person who represents you, if you are in the minority, is someone you voted against. So we have all of these very highfalutin notions of what representation means, and yet we don't come to grips with the notion that in many instances, look, for example, at the recent election in New York where Mayor Bloomberg won by less than 51% of the vote, almost half of the people voted against the person who was elected, and yet we assume that person is now going to represent their interests as well as the interests of the people who voted for him. Now, there are lots of arguments as to why this could be true. One is this notion of virtual representation. The idea of virtual representation is that you are represented as a district or as a city in the case of New York. And when you are represented in New York, even if you voted against Mayor Bloomberg, he is going to look out for the interests of all of the citizens in New York City because, after all, he's the mayor of New York City. He's not going to be accountable to just people who are identified as his constituents. Or, in terms of a legislative body, we have the idea of virtual representation, that even if you're not represented by the particular member of Congress or the particular member of the state Senate or the particular member of the state House who actually represents your district, even if you didn't vote for that person, there are other people in the state legislature whom you would have voted for if you had lived in their district. And those people share your interests, and thus those people are in a position to represent you even though you did not vote for them. So you could be represented by somebody that you voted against, or you could be represented by somebody that if you had had the chance to vote for them, you would have. Now, I want to argue that there is something flawed in that concept of representation because, number one, it puts too much weight on the moment of choice, that is the election, to determine what your relationship is with a particular representative. And that moment of choice, I would argue, is corrupted by the fact that in legislative bodies in particular, the people who are determining that choice for you, that is the people who are drawing your districts, are the people who are themselves invested in a district that is going to be composed of people most likely to vote for them. But I also want to suggest that there is something wrong with that concept because representation, in my view, is a relationship. It is not simply a moment of choice. Representation is a relationship. It is an ongoing relationship, and it is not simply a relationship between the voter and the person he or she voted for. It is also a horizontal relationship among the constituents, among the people who are being represented. Because in many ways, the only way you can hold a representative accountable to your ideals, to your hopes, or to your articulated interests is if you create a constituency of accountability that continues to exist after the election. And that is part of the reason that we have such a conflict in our system about the role that lobbyists play rather than voters, because the lobbyists, they don't limit themselves just to putting money into election campaigns, they also provide money for the next election campaign, and through that buy themselves access to the representative between elections. Whereas ordinary citizens, in many instances, in most instances, I would suggest, are limited to access to their candidate or to their representative, either to do constituent service, right, where they're one-on-one asking that the street lights be repaired on their street, or in terms of getting certain promises out of the candidate that will then induce them to vote for that person on election day. But there's not the same ongoing relationship that is built up between the representative and the lobbyists. And I just want to give you an example of this from today's New York Times. There was an interesting article about the health care bill that just came out of the United States Senate. And the article was, it actually may have been a little confusing because the maps were very hard to read. But what was particularly interesting to me is that many of the people who suggested that they were not going to vote for, or many of the Democrats who were not willing to state that they were prepared to vote for health care reform, came from states such as Arkansas, where, based on polling data, a majority of the people actually supported health care reform. But Blanche Lincoln, according to this op-ed thesis, was motivated in her reluctance to sign on to health care, not because of her constituents' preferences on health care, but based on the number of people in her state who voted for or against Barack Obama. That was the thesis of this particular op-ed. Now, why would she be more worried about whether people voted for or against Barack Obama than whether people are for or against health care? In other words, why is she worried about the potential political implications for Barack Obama rather than the actual needs as articulated by her constituents? And I would suggest that what's driving a lot of our politics is the self-interest of the elected officials. It is not the interests of their constituents, it is the interests of the elected officials in continuing to be elected officials. So they see representation not as a public service per se, in which they are bound by the interests of their constituents. They see it as an opportunity to ascend the ladder of success as an individual. And when I suggest that blacks are the miner's canary in this, I started thinking about this in the context of a book written by James Philip Thompson called Double Trouble, in which he described a different mayor of New York City. This is now a black mayor, Mayor Dinkins, who was actually trying to represent the interests of poor people in the city in a number of initiatives, and assumed that he could rely on other black elected officials who also represented poor people, many of whom, not surprisingly, were black. And it turned out that David Dinkins was wrong, that when you look at many of the black elected officials at the city council level in New York City, they were more interested in the Lulus, that is, in the perks that the president of the city council was using to get them to vote against Dinkins' objectives. In other words, they'd get a bigger office, they might get a chairmanship. They were in a position to ascend the ladder of personal success, and then they could rationalize that by saying that they were actually helping their constituents, even though they were voting against the interests of their constituents. They were helping their constituents because when they became more important, they would be in a better position to represent their constituents. But of course, if their focus is on their personal, individual career advancement, then it's hard for people to believe or to trust that their representatives are actually looking out for them. So what's the consequence of this? The consequence of this is there's very low voter turnout in the United States. Now, part of it is our representational system per se, but another part is because we have winner-take-all districts, and because you therefore have to get to very close to 50% in order to win anything, you only have 2 political parties. Unlike Germany, unlike most European countries, unlike most of the world, we only have 2 political parties, and so many of the interests that people have are not represented by one of the 2 political parties, but more importantly, the role that political parties play in a democracy where you have multiple parties is to mobilize constituents, and to mobilize them not just so that they will vote for a particular candidate on election day, but to mobilize them so that they will actually participate in the process of governing over the course of the term. So not just before the election, not just on election day, but most importantly, when the person is elected, to hold that person accountable. And one of the people, not surprisingly, who understands this is in fact Barack Obama. He wrote or was interviewed when he first got into politics in 1995. He was interviewed as to why he was deciding to leave the role of community organizer, leave the role of a lawyer. And he said he really thought it was important for a representative to function like a community organizer, to function as someone who would mobilize his or her constituents to hold them accountable. So in many ways, the argument I'm trying to make is that we need to look at the experience of those who have been left out, those who are in a minority, who often don't get their preferences represented directly because they are in a minority, and see this as a function of a winner-take-all electoral system that puts too much emphasis on elections, that uses geographic districts as the main instrument for allocating political power, that gives representatives the opportunity to draw those districts for themselves, and that emphasizes the importance of voting, of a discrete moment of choice over the much more nuanced and, in my view, much more robust concept of representation or representative democracy, in which voters and citizens play a role, a participatory role in collective decision-making before, during, and after the election. My time is up, but during questions, I'd be happy to answer questions as to examples of this alternative.
Thank you, Professor Guinier. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. Jim Sleeper.
Well, Lani has made very clear that those girls should never have designed that game, and moreover, segregating the teams by sex. How did that happen? In the enlightened 1990s, and it's such a group, it should never have happened. There's a reason why it happened. There's an element of redress. There's an element of history. It's when you learn about a group of girls designing a game that the boys have to play on terms that are maybe not advantageous to them, there is a kind of a sense of redressing a balance. Look, the only, Lani and I are, I don't know if this will disappoint or surprise you, we're really soulmates in all of these arguments. The only difference I have is that I got called names for making some of these arguments about 10 or 15 years ago in liberal racism. You did too, that's true. Boy, you sure did. In fact, we got called different kinds of names, but those were the old days. Justice Harry Blackmun, in the famous Bakke case, said the following: in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must first treat them differently. That's the rubric under which you might understand why the girls got to design a game that the boys didn't play after all the years, and why certain things were calibrated, counted, and adjusted in the ways that we've gone through doing since Brown v. Board. And rightly so, and yet often mistakenly so, in terms of the unintended consequences and the problems that arose from it. We must first take account of race, Blackman said. The operative word is first. Maybe he should have said, if we want to get beyond racism, we must temporarily take more account of race. We must take account of race in certain ways. We don't want to reinstitutionalize or recapitulate. We don't want the law to freeze frame people in to racial identities that merely turn the tables or that recapitulate the old resentments. Where do we go? And that, I think, is the question that Professor Guinier is raising very well and very powerfully. Many of the things she said today are drawn from a law review article which I read last week, and it's terrific. I agree with basically everything in it. The canary in the coal mine analogy is an apt one. That's not just a historical question. As long as people of a certain group are disadvantaged, are marginalized, they're going to be that canary in the coal mine. But of course, unlike the canary, there is nothing inherent about blacks or anyone by virtue of their race or gender that makes them perpetually a canary and that makes them constantly destined to exercise that function for the rest of the society. You see? You see where the element of condescension or misreading could enter in. And I've been trying in all my work to lean against that. When I wrote a book called Liberal Racism in 1997, I was trying to make that argument clear. And people said, oh, well, you're naively rushing ahead to presumptions of colorblindness when we're not ready. Well, I was saying it's coming, and we have to get ready, because we're beginning to experience diminishing returns from color coding things in ways that recapitulate the problems we were trying to solve. It was a hard argument to make, and there were a lot of tempers and a lot of things that flew back and forth as that argument was made. One of the things I like most about what Professor Guinier is saying today is the question of mobilization ahead of identification. More than basing things on descriptive identification, you look for the extent to which people are using their communal or racial or whatever solidarity to raise issues that really transcend themselves. And the operative principle I would want to say and urge upon all of us is that in a republic like this one, making the claims that it does to universalism, and we know how often they're violated, nevertheless, there's kind of a two-tiered level at which this goes on. Each of us may be raised in a particular racial, ethno-racial, religious group or subculture with which we may identify very deeply, within which we may have undergone rites of passage, experiences in our formative years that defined us, to which we sing, to which we have feelings of loyalty and bonding. Each of us may be raised that way. But if that community is really good, if it's deep, if it's resonant, and not something that's been concocted in response to incentives or because dollars have been attached to identifying yourself a certain way, if it comes from somewhere else, somewhere real, then inevitably what happens is we graduate from it at the same time that we remain rooted in it. We graduate into a larger civic culture that is itself thick enough to live in, an American one. That's the gamble on which the country is based. It's a tricky one. We can't pretend that what we try and do in this country is temper the universal with the parochial without succumbing to the tribal, to the kinds of ingrained hostilities and presumptive suspicions of people in which we start judging people by who their grandparents were. Now, as soon as you bring in the law and start labeling people, as Blackman said we must, at times, in certain ways, to take account of race, you are also, in a sense, saying, oh, I know because of who your grandparents were, what your liabilities are and what your needs are. There is a historical integrity to doing that. There is a much needed reason to do it after years of denial. And yet, at a certain point, if we are affirming certain deeper human things about ourselves, through that process, there's a point at which we graduate from it. When I was writing the book, Liberal Racism, in 1997, people didn't want to hear that. to some extent, the candidacy of Obama, the kind of campaign he ran, was really the answer to my dreams, because he was saying, I am rooted in a community. In fact, it's very interesting what he did. He grew up outside of the African American, formerly slave community. He could have become one of the cosmopolitan affirmative action beneficiaries, Hawaii, a very tolerant atmosphere. He did not have to marry into and, in a sense, join himself to, as an act of conviction and historical and personal research. He did not have to bind himself to Southside Chicago, but he did. And that amazing balance. And 2 days before the election, don't forget what he did. He took a day off to visit the white mother of his white mother. This is a guy who's a very complicated guy, who chose to re-engage things he did not have to engage, even though they were forced upon him in so many ways. And the way he handled it is the way, in my dreams, I would have liked to have handled something like that. Whatever his liabilities or weaknesses as president, I do think he walked us through what I am trying to say we should have gone through and be going through in terms of graduating from the kind of racial color coding. On the question of electocracy, I sort of grew up intellectually on Paulo Freire, liberation. How many of you know of him? I see some nodding. He wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed that influenced me very deeply in the years before I packed all my belongings into a yellow van and moved into central Brooklyn and spent 10 years immersed in the life and work of Black and Hispanic communities in very mixed polyglot neighborhoods in northern Brooklyn. There I published a small weekly newspaper, and then I wound up writing for the Village Voice and for a quarterly Dissent, which I'm still involved with, and wound up working for daily newspapers in New York and in city government. Incidentally, I want to put in a plug for that, for doing that. I know that the coolest and most imperative thing for many of you now is to go abroad, and there are endless incentives and programs to do it, and I support it totally. And I've just come back from 6 months in Germany. But I want to put in a plug for going to places like Brooklyn, like East LA, like parts of Miami, where there are more languages spoken and more ethno-racial immigrant groups living side by side, alongside African Americans and Puerto Ricans and white ethnics and old stock WASP, than you'll find in London, Istanbul, or Hong Kong. And the other thing you get to do if you go to those inner cities of America and immerse yourself is you get to see the American Republic trying to renew its claim to be a universal and trans-ethnic nation, where we do try and temper the universal with the parochial without succumbing to the tribe. But to get back to the main point, the question about race and how we balance it, I think it's to get beyond electocracy and to get into the kind of mobilization, the kind of nurture of democratic dialogic work that Paulo Freire talked about, that Jürgen Habermas talks about, and that I think Professor Guinier is experiencing and talking about very well. We probably want to get away from spending our time trying to color code the electocracy. And, you know, a lot of what I wrote about in liberal racism were the battles that were fought with the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act and the efforts to reapportion districts along race lines after that, to try and turn the tables on race, to try and get our hands around this question of who designed the game, who drew the lines. So if they gerrymandered things one way, we were going to gerrymander things along race to give people a chance to elect a candidate of their choice. And what I think we are all beginning to acknowledge is that if we focus upon the real questions of political mobilization, of what it really is involved in developing a democratic civic culture, it turns out to have less to do with trading on racial solidarity or bonds of race than you might think. It turns out to require things that are in all of us and not in all of us, that need development regardless of race, regardless of color. And to freeze frame people into a racial district that is designed to empower them because their skin color or surname is presumed to be a common bond that lends to them a political purpose, has basically been discredited. Yes, if you're going up against systemic racist drawing of lines that prevents existing communities of color, where people are bonded and living together, and it divides them up and puts some of them in this district, some of them in that district, and prevents them from being able to express what their historical experience and their grievances are, then that's racist and that's wrong. And the original Voting Rights Act was designed in 1965 to prevent that. For example, in central Brooklyn, where I was, in central Bedford-Stuyvesant, you had a large, coherent, historic black community of some 50 years standing that had always been subdivided into different congressional districts so that blacks could never form a majority in any one, and there could be no black congressman reflecting that existing community. The 1965 Voting Rights Act prevented that and created the district from which Shirley Chisholm became one of the first, I think it was the first woman black congressman and certainly the first to run for president years later. That was a necessary and important transitional step. What I think we did wrong when we then further amended the Voting Rights Act in '82 was to say, if by any stretch of the imagination you can find some black community over here and another one over here and another one here, and one may be middle class and homeowning and other may be public housing project residents, and they're separated not only by miles and different kinds of communities but by interest, if you can connect them into one district to give them a majority, you must do so. Why? Because they are black. And the absurdity of this really came to evident in some of the cases of Hispanics in New York. There was a famous district. It became called the Bullwinkle District because when it was drawn on a map, it actually spread out so far. It looked like Bullwinkle's horns and face. And it started by taking some welfare recipients living in public housing on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The district borders then crossed the Brooklyn and Williamsburg Bridge and went down into Brooklyn to connect these people with some Mexican and other immigrant Latino workers. And then it followed some corridors that were only a couple blocks wide for several miles up into leafy suburban neighborhoods in Queens to connect the welfare mothers on the Lower East Side and the immigrant workers in Borough Park and parts of Brooklyn to middle-class homeowning Latino immigrants in Queens. Why? Because they all had Hispanic surnames. And this was supposed to be empowerment. I mean, it was wishful, it was idealistic, and you can talk about historical redress and the grievances you're overcoming, but I think it was a literal imposition. It's like giving everybody a set of crutches to go to the polls and then being surprised that no one turns up. Because, of course, no one did turn up. Because the incumbent in the district, who actually is a pretty good person, Nydia Velazquez, who could challenge her? If the district includes pieces of 21 different school boards and 31 different police precincts and little hospital districts, little slices of each one, where is the new leader who's going to challenge her? Where is the base of the opposition? What is the coherence? I was running a newspaper in one of the neighborhoods that was involved in this district, and because of the way the congressional district lines were drawn, if people in this neighborhood of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, wanted to get together to discuss what was happening with federal funding for their school board, the Hispanics in the room would have one congressman, and the Hasidic Orthodox Jews in the room would have another congressman. It doesn't make sense. And so there is a sense in which Tip O'Neill was right, all politics is local. There is a certain geographical thing to certain dimensions of politics, and people have to talk to each other, and they have to engage despite all the obstacles. And the victories that they eventually win have to be won that hard way. So that was one of the points I definitely wanted to make very clear. Also, it is becoming less and less clear who really wants to self-identify as members of a group and in what way. And this is, I'll ask this in a sense that makes sense for some of you as students. At the Kennedy School years ago, I was talking about this, making these arguments, and a student asked me sort of reproachfully, he said, well, don't you believe in diversity? And I said, I don't know, let me ask you a question. I can see, I said to the student, that you are Asian. I think he might have been Korean, I couldn't tell, but your physiognomy, all I know about you is that you're Asian. Tell me 3 things you would like me to assume that I know about you based on the fact that I can see that you're Asian. And we all sort of laughed awkwardly because when push came to shove, nobody wants a bureaucrat, a professor, or a journalist saying, oh, I see that you are a certain ethnicity, and therefore I know the following 3 things about you, and will take them into account. When push comes to shove, you want your very American freedom to be able to self-define and to express it. No one can tell you, even if all your 4 grandparents, or however many you have, came from one specific homogeneous area, nobody can tell you in a country as fluid and ecumenical and as with demographic riptides and cultural changes like ours, no one can tell you what your ethnicity is but yourself in conversation with people that you choose to engage and that you trust. Now, when you come to college and you're away from home for the first time in many cases, unless this may have happened if you went to a boarding school before college, you're going to work through these questions of the very genuine cultural differences that you come bearing and that do differentiate you from classmates. And you're going to figure out what you want to do with these. How much assimilation, how much affirmation, how much defiance. And it's natural that during this time of your life, there's a certain amount of ethnic, racial, flag-waving, self-definition, a politics of defiance. These things are powerful impulses, and in some groups more than others. I think that what happens, though, if you're touched by liberal education, or I would argue, as I've been arguing throughout this talk, if you're touched by the promises or the hopes of the American Republic, such as Obama tried to embody them, you will eventually reach a balance that does try and temper the universal with the parochial without succumbing to the tribal. And that's really the point that I'm trying to make. I think we fought a lot of pointless battles trying to over-color code and over-determine these things, and I'll just close by saying that there were several constituencies for this. Some people who self-identify as a militantly aggrieved group do it because there are dollar signs attached by well-meaning people who create incentives and rewards and reparative things, and it's understandable. So it becomes a matter of claiming your Hispanic surname, even though you may be totally assimilated and only one of your grandparents was Hispanic and through your father you have an Hispanic surname. You may suddenly find yourself claiming it because there is a material reward to doing so. And I'm saying there are reasons why that makes sense in a transitional way, but reasons why we should be graduating beyond it. Let me see, there was one more point I wanted to make. My time is almost up. Well, the main point I want to make is also, it's not about dollar signs only. The attractions of ethno-racial self-affirmation, I think, recede if you've been touched by liberal education. The whole point of liberal education is it asks you to engage things that are universal, that go back in time, that are classically rooted, that do give you something in common with others. And I'm in favor of a certain kind of core curriculum that gives people common resonances and references. I am not saying that a person should not choose to spend their life enriching and affirming an ethno-racial identity. I'm saying that they should only do it freely, and that no one should feel incentivized, corralled, or coerced by well-meaning, redress-oriented methods into making an identification that does not come from the deepest kinds of things that I hope you're acquiring in a liberal education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sleeper. We're now going to move into the Q&A part of this event, starting off with the speakers asking each other one question. Professor Guinier, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would like to ask Jim Sleeper what he thinks race is.
Ooh. What do I think race is? I think I'll be provocative. I think that at its root, it's a negligible physiognomic difference that has come to acquire its cultural resonances and depths for two reasons. One is people grew up on different continents originally in different races. But two, it's basically what's been imposed on people. I'm a Lithuanian Jew by background. All my four grandparents came from a certain section of Lithuania. Should I go back to Lithuania to be with my fellow white people? They weren't very nice to, it didn't matter. The race meant nothing. There was an ethno-racial distinction that acquired connotations of race in terms of what happened to Jews in Lithuania in the Holocaust. Blacks who have gone back to Africa, African Americans, have often been surprised to find that people didn't really even consider them as belonging there. So I think that most of what we assume, what we call race in America, is stuff that has been done to us or done by history, but is not inherent in us. And that how we negotiate this balance of the physiognomic and the historical and the cultural is the question, and that America stands for doing it more fluidly and more ecumenically.
Thank you. And
now I guess I could ask you to tell me, I really want to know what you think about what I just said. So that's maybe a cop-out, but I'm serious. I'd love to know how you...
Well, the reason I asked the question is coming from your example of the Asian student who came up to you and you said, what are the three things that I want to know about? What are the three things that you think I already know about you because I can see that you're Asian? And the concern I have with that framing, and it also applies to the concern I have with your description of the Bullwinkle district in Brooklyn, is that it's preoccupied with the personal and interpersonal effect of race or racism, but it doesn't acknowledge the cultural or the institutional effects of race or racism. So in many ways, when I think about race, I've started to think about it as a question of racial literacy. And when I talk about racial literacy, it's really understanding that race is not simply who you are or who the people are that you fraternize with. It is a structural and an environmental condition. It's like passive smoke. So you don't have to be the smoker to be in the room where you are inhaling these toxic fumes. And race, therefore, often conditions and determines the life circumstances of people beyond their control. So if you look, for example, at questions not of income but of wealth, and you look at the median wealth of whites, it's about $90,000. That is, white families, white households have about $90,000 of wealth, meaning accumulated assets that are more than their debt. And if you look at Latino households, the median net worth is about $8,000, right, compared to $90,000 for whites. And for blacks, it's $6,000 compared to $90,000 for whites. And almost 30% of blacks and Latinos have zero net worth or negative net worth. So this is the legacy, the ongoing legacy of slavery and of discrimination. And you're absolutely right that you can't tell from simply looking at somebody whether they happen to be one of the blacks who has more net worth than others. But if you're talking about statistical probabilities, you're in a position to predict that if you're looking at a group of whites and you're looking at a group of blacks, that the group of whites, unless they come from a very poor community, are going to be much better off in terms of their social mobility, their capacity to purchase homes, which is the largest source of household net wealth in this country. And so when you talked about the Bullwinkle district, what worried me is this sense that people were being collected simply because of their race or ethnicity, when in fact there may have been other reasons or other things that they had in common from these even though they lived separately, that they had in common because they had experienced a common history. That's number one. But number two, it worries me because we see race, right? So we see the Bullwinkle district, and we see that they have taken 3 physically isolated communities and linked them for the purpose of districting. But my position is all districting is gerrymandering, right? So we're focused on this one district that Nydia Velasquez was representing, but I think all districting is gerrymandering in the sense that the elected official drew lines to determine whether to go down this street or another street because they didn't want the people on this side of the street in their district. So I'm not suggesting that the Velasquez district is the perfect district, but I'm suggesting that it is not as different as we make it out to be from what is characteristic of all of our districts. That is, they are an opportunity for those who are in power to perpetuate their hold on power.
Great, thank you. I invite those of you that like to line up at the microphones to ask questions. Usually we have a lot of questions, so I'd ask you all to keep your questions really succinct and hopefully no longer than 35 seconds. On the same note, I'd ask both our speakers to keep their answers as short as possible as well. One final note, each lecture we give out the Hardball Award to the person who asks the most challenging, interesting, and thoughtful question. If you wish to be considered for the award, please state your full name before you ask your question. However, beware if you ask a particularly easy question to our speakers, in which case the shameful softball award awaits you. So with that, let's begin over here.
Wow, quite a challenge here.
And do you have to carry that on a spoon?
Yeah.
My name is Alexandra Flinder, and I teach public policy, immigration policy specifically here. And I have a question for each of the speakers. For Dr. Guinier, I would like to ask you, you mentioned that basically you talked about 2 things. The problems of majoritarianism is the one thing, and the problems with professional politics is the other thing. And you somehow seem to imply that by going into a PR system, we would get better representation because you wouldn't have the first past the post electoral system, which drives people to sort of represent only the constituencies who actually elect them. But if the problem is actually professional politics and the fact that it's the moment of choice rather than the relationship that actually drives political behavior at the representative level, then aren't we confusing 2 different processes? Is it really changing the system that's going to take care of the professionalization of politics? Or is it just changing the system? We'll just change the system, but we will have the same kind of problems that are due to having professional politicians rather than politicians who are more driven by real care for society.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with you that there are multiple problems, but I have not suggested that the solution to the multiple problems is a PR system. I do think a PR system is better than a simple majoritarian system because it tends to encourage coalition government rather than this bipartisan government. But you're absolutely correct that it doesn't address the professionalism or the professionalization concern. And in that domain, I would prefer something much more like what they do in Porto Alegre, Brazil, which is participatory budgeting, in which the people themselves are creating the budgets for communities, and they convene initially in large representative assemblies, and then they select people who are going to represent them from the people who are present, who serve at most a year or 2 years. It's not like they become a professional politician. And the advantage of this participatory budgeting format, they've had 100,000 people over about a 10-year period participating in participatory budgeting. And what it does is that It allows the people from the community who are very well-to-do, whose interests in terms of the budget are to build more museums or to create cultural opportunities because all of their basic needs are taken care of. It allows them or encourages them to actually have to deal with people who don't have clean water. And in that process of deliberation and interaction, that's where I was talking about the horizontal relationships are built so that the people themselves are part of the collective decision-making process. So I'm absolutely on board with your critique of PR as not solving the professionalization of politics problem. But I'm not advocating PR as the solution. I certainly think it's better than gerrymandering districts, but I don't think it's the solution at all. And in fact, as Jim suggested, the piece that I sent him is called Beyond Electocracy, meaning it's not simply who gets elected and what system of rules you use to get them elected on election day. It's really developing a collective efficacy approach or a mobilization of collective will from the community where people begin to take ownership of these decisions and not simply delegate them to professional politicians.
I'll just add 5 seconds to that. I agree with that. And to me, it's, you can tinker as much as you want with the electoral mechanisms. And I shouldn't say tinker because some of the reforms are consequential. The real question is what new models of community organizing, independent of the elections, can be undertaken. We've both admired things that the Industrial Areas Foundation does, you with Ernie Cortez and I with some people in Brooklyn. They have a way of getting people together that make the elected officials dance to their tune because of the terrific kind of organizing they do. But that's a discussion for another context. So I agree that the electoral solutions per se don't solve the problem.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Professor Rose, a professor here. Hi, Professor Guinier. I vowed I wouldn't ask a question, but I couldn't control myself. I'm really struck, Mr. Sleeper, by this discussion about the perils of addressing race in a way that doesn't quite grasp the role of whiteness sufficiently to me as a racial category, not ethno-whiteness, but the move from white ethnicity to whiteness as an ethnically neutral category of racialized power as a social formation. And so what ran through, despite the fact that I think the idea of colorblindness in the abstract could be a very interesting idea, although I don't think seeing color is the problem, it's really what we do with it that matters, it's not the visualizing it. But I don't really see in any way how we get to any of that conversation unless we explore really whiteness as a social structure and as a source of power, not just race when it's not white. In other words, we look at race in a sense whenever it's non-whites identifying racially. So I guess, so there's just a number of ways in which this happened. The Canaries revision in which you said, well, canaries will not always be black. Well, I'd say, well, if we keep the mines, we keep going into the mines, right, then yeah, they will likely wind up being the canary if we keep the structure in context, which is what I hear Professor Guinier asking us to rethink. The same thing's true of liberal education, which begins as a white supremacist structure, frankly, for reproducing the idea that some people around the world are more important and valuable than others, and of course there's been all these fights and struggles to transform it, all kinds for many, many years. But the idea that a liberal education that's not necessarily racially self-conscious about its own history, that it can somehow save us, I think is a little bit frightening to me because I see that work undermining the very thing I think you are trying to get to, if you see what I mean. So it's not that I'm against your goal, I think we probably agree, but I'm concerned about the invisibility of whiteness and Professor, the way it maintains. So my question is, so what do you make of whiteness as an existing, not a historical force, but in the present tense, a structural force, and how would you go about undermining that in this notion of how race matters? Thank you.
Well, I think the kind of whiteness you're talking about is something that is conceptualized and developed mostly within the academy, and that in the real world, whiteness is rapidly being dethroned. It's being dethroned demographically in terms of sheer numbers, not only here, but in terms of the world, in terms of the rise of India and China, and what we're going to experience in this country as we become second and then third in regard to that. I also think that whiteness is being dethroned within this country itself, and it's one of the great things about this country, the number of multiracial children, of young people who really are generations removed by now from any distinctly recoverable ethno-racial identity. How we redefine these things, people's capacity endlessly to define themselves into hostile camps against one another can assume new forms in which whiteness may or may not play a role. But I think we're just living through, how do I undermine it? I think it is being undermined. I think it is being deconstructed, not by our theories, but by certain things that we've set in motion by hewing to the kind of ideals I've struck for. I think that's what the original civil rights movement was doing. When Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus, she was actually presenting herself not only as a black person, but as a proper working woman who had worked a hard day's work and didn't like being pushed around. And she didn't call the bus driver a racist mofo or whatever she might have called him. She basically stood on her rights as an American citizen in a transracial way. She decided to elevate the civil society rather than trash it as inherently irredeemably racist. She did both things at the same time. And that was, I think, the genius of that approach. So I think conceptualizing whiteness as a reality and that it does condition us, absolutely true. But as to how to get at it, I think it's going.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Feigenbaum. I'm a student here. And I don't know if I'll be able to follow up that question, but I just wanted to ask about institutions within Congress, for example, the Congressional Black Caucus or the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and this is for both of you. I was wondering, Congressman Steve Cohen in Tennessee is a white man who represents a majority black district, and he was also the author of a resolution apologizing for slavery, and he applied to join the Congressional Black Caucus, and they rejected him, and I was wondering what each of you felt about that decision, how that impacts the effectiveness of groups like the CBC, and basically how you think they should have gone about with that decision.
So I don't know enough about the dynamics in terms of what the Congressional Black Caucus mission statement is and whether it's based simply on being black or on not being white. Because one of the things, just to connect your question to what Tricia was asking earlier, I actually think that the dynamic is not about whiteness, but about not being black. That is, I think, even in light of what you're saying about multiracial, that we're developing into a society in which there are two categories. You're black or you're not black. And if you're not black, then you have many of the privileges of what we used to associate with being white. But if you're black, those are the people that will continue to be, especially poor and black, will be continued to be ferried almost directly from school to prison in ways that not only affect their own lives, but affect the lives of their community. Because an interesting thing that most people don't realize is that when we are counting census data to allocate power in terms of representative districts, prisoners are counted as residents of the prison and therefore are residents of the rural community in which the prison is located, and that community then gets all of the federal dollars that come from having more of a population. They also have, it's very much like the 3/5 clause, they also have enhanced political representation with people who are in prison who can't vote. So there are many ways in which we are taking people who are black and putting them into a situation in which their racial identity, I think, becomes even more salient. In terms of the Congressional Black Caucus and Steve Cohen, Steve Cohen is a complicated figure. In one of the cases that I teach, and I don't remember the name of the case offhand, he had a very odd position in terms of why he thought that the Voting Rights Act did not apply in terms of its enforcement. And his position was that he and others had introduced a bill to celebrate the birthday of Martin Luther King, and that showed that they were really on the side of black people. And so it wasn't important for blacks to be able to select their own representative, because he obviously was sympathetic to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that defines all that he is, because, as I said, I'm not familiar enough with him or the Congressional Black Caucus. I certainly think that white people can represent black people. So if the Congressional Black Caucus is a organization of people whose constituencies are predominantly black, then they obviously made a mistake in not admitting him. If, however, their mission is to create a place for people who themselves identify as black to be part of a caucus, then it's a very different question as to whether he identifies himself as black, which I don't believe he does.
Yeah, I kind of followed that, but not closely, and I agree. I mean, he may be partly opportunistic. You know, he's a good politician. He wants to be elected. He's going to cite these things, and it is opportunistic. But he may also be a sincere liberal who wants to advance these right issues. So the two things may go together. I want to just say this thing about, Lani has mentioned this a couple times now, both in terms of median incomes and in terms of...
Not incomes. Definitely not wealth.
Wealth. Well, you were talking about assets, right. No, I understand.
Not incomes.
All right, I agree. The class correlation with race is undeniable, it's historic, and it's enduring. The question is how we get at it. And if you want to raise the questions about why we have class structures in America, not just why they've been racialized, but why they're there anyway and would be even if the country were suddenly all white. I mean, that's what we're learning now from these Tea Party people and demonstrators. We have a lot of people who are never going to own homes again. They thought they were white and secure, and they were making $28 an hour at the auto plant, and it's gone. And they're only 50 years old, and they're losing their home. There's a lot of stuff going on, and blacks are the canary in the coal mine, and if these people had paid attention that way earlier, they might have done something earlier rather than listen to Rush Limbaugh and find scapegoats. But the truth is that somebody has got to come up with a politics that really gets at these class issues. And if the Black Caucus wants to get at those class issues, then maybe this is a guy they should listen to if he's sincere and not just opportunistic. So that's where I think class cuts across the idea of racial remedies for the problem, even when blacks are the canary.
Could I just,
Yeah,
I wanted to say that I agree with the last thing that Jim Sleeper said, and I wanted to give an example of what he may be talking about. There is a NAACP chapter in a prison in Maine. Maine is one of the whitest states in the United States. There are 90 people who are signed up to be in this chapter, most of whom are white. The president of the chapter is a white male. Vice president is a black male. And the head of the national NAACP went recently to meet with the Maine prison chapter of the NAACP. And what struck me as very relevant to this particular conversation is the comment that the black vice president made with the assent of the white president of the NAACP chapter of the Maine prison. And that was, if you are a felon in this country, you need civil rights too. So there was a sense in which they were creating this political race that was not based on physiognomy, but based on a sense that white prisoners have very similar needs or concerns as many black people, and that it turned out the NAACP was one of the few associations that focused on that connection by trying to encourage the development of this chapter in this Maine prison.
Thank you. We're going to take 3 or 4 more questions.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. My name is Natasha Go, and first I have an observation, and that is I'm a multiracial individual, and I think my experience of being at Brown, which is a liberal arts institution, has made me much more racially conscious. And I think the experience of some students of color here definitely agrees with that
feeling othered in what was founded as a white institution is a very, very racially conscious process. Now, my question. So many conservatives and liberals espouse this idea of colorblindness, but I rarely hear people of color who support colorblindness. So in that way, is colorblindness not an inherently racist concept? Thanks.
Do you want to say something? Was that especially for me or for? No, I mean, I tried to address this at the beginning. I said that I was often cast, when I made the arguments that I've been making, as, oh, you're one of those apostles of utopian colorblindness, which is really hypocritical because you're basically denying the historical realities of race. And what I'm trying to say is the historical realities, the circumstances of race are real. I mean, Brown was founded the way it was founded. It now has the president it has. I mean, there are a lot of things that are undergoing lots of changes. And I also said that it is natural and inevitable that people who come to college go through a process of racially working out their self-identification, sometimes more defiantly than others, sometimes by othering other people. This is part of a process of reckoning with your own boundaries and what you're going to emphasize and what you're going to trade on and what you're going to not. I think there was a time when people felt that if they ran a racial identity up the flag, a non-white racial identity, it was going to stop other people and make them step back and do something respectful. I don't think that's going to happen very much. I think it's becoming much more fluid, and we have to get at it in a different way. I think that many of the sources of serious grievance are class sources. Our sources are caused by economic and other injustice. These have been racialized throughout our history. And those whose history has been that of having economic disadvantage slapped on them because of race. Capitalism trades on race. It used to trade on it a lot more. Now it's shuffling our racial and libidinal decks in ways that people thought it never would. So there's a lot of stuff going on now that's a little bit strange. And I don't think that, I think identifying oneself ethno-racially and trying to decide what contribution one's culture and historical experience can make to addressing these problems is essential and valuable, but I don't think it's a long-run solution.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Brian Bishop. Point of order, just on a question two ago. As of the 2006 election cycle, when my friend Richard Pombo was the chairman of the Portuguese American Caucus, Patrick Kennedy was the vice chairman. And I don't allege at all that that's a precisely identical circumstance, but it's not so far off. I can't think of anyone more recognizably Irish Catholic, but perhaps ecumenical in that sense. My question is, it seems that the focus on representation for the benefit of identity seems to have a subtext of how that representation might be used to create positive benefit. And when we look at wealth, which I would totally agree with the circumstances, the numbers presented, the idea is, how do you change that positively? It seems to me we arrived there, however, because we failed to protect the rights. We failed to limit government. We failed to make government minimalist enough so that it could not create those kind of inequities. And now as we debate incorporating the Second Amendment, the debates, I've read the debates, and not all of them, but some of the debates at the time that the 14th Amendment was adopted, and one of the greatest fears for adopting the 14th Amendment was that blacks would be able to own guns.
I'm sorry, could you?
So my question is, do you think this question of identity should go to how the government could protect people rather than how it could benefit them directly in terms of wealth transfer?
Thank you.
I don't understand the question. What's the difference between protect and benefit?
For me, I think the difference between protect and benefit is that many positive examples. I heard Reginald Jones and many people speak passionately about positive examples of black communities that flourished on their own and were disrupted by the interference of government and government processes that weren't really seeking benefits from the government. They were seeking to be protected, in a sense, to be free.
So let me just say that the government has done a lot of harm to many people in this country, and in particular to African Americans. So I'm sympathetic in some ways to what you're suggesting, but, and just to give an example, the FHA after World War II, when you had all of these returning GIs, specifically included in its regulations prohibitions on providing mortgage subsidies or mortgage assistance to communities that had blacks in them, because the value of the homes might go down with the presence of black homeowners. Now, to me, that is something that is neither protecting blacks or benefiting them, and it is something that the government, in my view, needs to make amends for, even if it's 50 or 60 years later. So that's why it's not clear to me that there's a way in which you can just, single slice this and say, okay, these are protections, these are benefits, and the government should do one and not the other. I think the government should do justice, and justice is something that needs to be deliberated and debated, but there's not a single rule as to what makes one thing just and something else unjust. So I really do think that context matters, and that you can't have a universal claim about protection versus benefit.
We had a long history, we have had an ongoing history in which both benefits and protections have been distributed racially, obviously. And these figures that we cite economically are legacies of that maldistribution along race lines. Again, I go back to what Blackman said. We must first take account of that and lean against it. But to the extent that we start institutionalizing or demanding that it be divvied up along those kinds of lines, we're making the same mistake, except as a matter of transitional redress. There has to be a coming to terms with why the inequities exist, not only with how they're parceled out.
Thank you. We have time for two last quick questions and answers.
Thank you. My question is about Justice Clarence Thomas's views on this sort of topic, and more specifically, as you know, he views civil rights as individual rights, not group rights, and he feels that way because he believes that the Declaration of Independence requires that. And I just wondered what the two fine speakers thought about his approach to this question. Thank you.
That's yours. You know that one.
That's such a difficult question to respond to, except to say I disagree with it. I could give you lots of reasons why I disagree with it, but to the extent that he and Justice Scalia claim to be originalists and that they're trying to understand a document that was drafted by, as I said, slave owners, and they're trying to understand a document that was drafted by slave owners in a way that gives credit to what the slave owners were trying to do, because originalism basically says that there was an original consensus that we have to abide. I find that not only wrong, but offensive. So I disagree.
And I agree with I agree with Lani completely on this. I don't know what else to add to that. Thomas, the one great thing he said was that he once described the segregational system under which he grew up as a totalitarian system. But he just was doing that in the usual anti-communist rhetorical way that people inveigh against totalitarianism, rightly so. But anyway, I agree.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Kyle Poyer. I'm the director of the steering committee which put on this event. And I have a question that gets to more of the short-term aspects of political representation and identity. I was wondering what the two speakers think of identity politics in the context of LGBT individuals, particularly thinking of them as a separate identity group that deserves representation, particularly descriptive representation in the context of, not seeing LGBT representatives.
Well, I haven't thought that through, and I would say I tend to be wary of the analogies that are sometimes too automatically made between race and sexual identity questions. To the extent that a sexual identity is something that you conceive yourself to have been born with, and that was not so much a matter of choice, it is inherently different from what we usually think of as race. To the extent to which a person of a given race chooses to affirm and identify it in a cultural and historical way and build upon it is different from the kind of self-discovery. I mean, there are analogies in terms of the gay community and LGBT and others trying to weave a kind of historical narrative through which they can conceptualize it. But to the extent that it's a matter of choice, and again, I'm not going to answer, I'm not going to come down on one side or the other of that. I think we have to be careful of drawing these identitarian analogies. I've always been wary about it, and I'm just going to flag it as problematic for me. But I'll stop there on that.
I don't understand the question.
Here he is.
Sure.
So what I'm referring to is there are groups that are concentrated, people with sort of majority LGBT identities who aren't represented in the sort of redistricting process. They're not seen as a separate identity or a separate community to be responsible to. So I wanted to know what you thought of that group as being a community that's seen as having an identity that should be represented by a particular group of individuals.
Again, so your question is, should people with a particular identity, it could be gays and lesbians, it could be women, it could be people who enjoy celebrating the 4th of July. I mean, you're saying it doesn't matter what your identity, should you be entitled to a particular district, or are you asking whether there's something particular about an LGBT identity that brings it into a special category? Well, I think that the premise of your question is problematic, because it is not that blacks or Latinos, based on their race, are entitled to a particular district. It is, at least if you think of the Voting Rights Act or other legislative policies, it is the evidence that the majority of people in a community deliberately vote against candidates who are associated with or favor that particular community, and as a result, that community is never represented by people who share their concerns or are accountable to their concerns. If a community, LGBT or whatever, can establish that there is polarized voting in the same way that blacks or Latinos have been able to establish this in order to justify drawing race-conscious or ethno-conscious districts, then I can understand a little bit better your question. But I don't. But I don't know that that people are trying to make that claim that they are entitled to a separate district. I think, as I understand it, many people are making the claim that they would like to see more people throughout the legislature who are accountable and concerned about their interests, because it's not simply where people live that determines their interests or whether they're represented, but that all of us have people in our family or people who are our friends who would benefit from having those issues raised more systematically. In that sense, it's very similar to the issue of women, that it's not as if women all live in one community and therefore you should have a district drawn simply, like a nunnery or something, that we're going to draw a district in order to represent these women, but that the issues of this particular population need to be infused into the concerns of the legislature writ large. So I mean, I don't think there's been that historical segregation of LGBTs in the same way that there has been for African Americans in particular. But I could be wrong, and that's why I'm asking for you to elaborate the premise of the question.
It might be a great argument for proportional representation
Right.
over geographical base, but once you get proportional representation, you understand what that means. I may go to the polls and vote as a white man, but I may also go to the polls and vote as a homeowner rather than as a tenant, or I may go to the polls and vote as a professor rather than as a working guy. What you decide to vote on the basis of is totally fluid and up to you in proportional representation. You're no longer locked into something. So on the one hand, it would answer your thing, but without affirming anything. It would just leave the opportunity, the option open.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you and invite you to the small reception. And let's have one more hand for both our speakers.